Well, welcome to Afternoon Light. And today we have a very special guest to discuss the story of Italian migration. This is a story that is at once familiar to many of us, but also, I think, quite mysterious. Who were these migrants to Australia of the 1950s who changed, simply speaking, our food culture, but also our attitudes eventually to non-British migration? While we often hear of the racism directed at early Italian migrants, it is the attitudes of those migrants to Australians that is, I think, less well known. This mistrust was not necessarily a one-way street. Joining me to discuss this history of Italians in Australia is Associate Professor Francesco Ricatti of the Australian National University. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Francesco.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. It's interesting, Francesco, the use of the term Italian when we're talking about Italian migrants to Australia. You yourself are Italian. Italy, as the sovereign state as we know it today, was not necessarily something that existed in when Italian migrants first started coming to Australia. Can you talk about what an Italian migrant is or who they are and where they've come from and why their identity isn't necessarily as clear as Italian?
Yeah, so Italy was unified in 1861. So in a sense, it's one of the youngest nations in Western Europe. And that means that before was divided in many different states, often occupied by or controlled by foreign powers. And because of that, they developed in different ways, different languages, different dialects, different food. This is also about the geography of Italy, of course, with mountains in the north, but also across the peninsula and the sea, many islands. There are many, many different local identities that were very important to Italians. So when we say that Italians started to migrate, often we are actually referring to Sicilians and Calabrians and people from the Veneto region or the Piedmont, and they had very different languages and identities. Of course, an idea of Italy has existed for a very long time. An idea of what Italian language could be has existed for a very long time. But there are also very significant differences, and particularly there were very significant differences before the 20th century when, radio and cinema and then later TV and school and the military really unified the country linguistically and socially and culturally.
And of course, today's discussion will focus on those Italians who came to Australia. But within Italy, how did the different parts of Italy view each other? If you were from Calabria or from Venice, Florence or all in between, were there animosities? Was there a sort of mistrust internally?
Yes, I mean, there is the north and there is the south. They're quite different. In between, there is Rome and the Romans who consider themselves special and kind of in their own right because of the Roman Empire and the Church and the Vatican and so on. There's been a lot of animosity, but also a lot of collaboration. And identities, of course, are fluid. So, when there is football, everyone is Italian because the Italian team is or used to be very strong at playing football. So that's an element of pride, and that's when everyone feel they are Italian. And there is a lot of animosity and racism between North and South, especially from the North towards the South. But at the same time, when they have to be racist towards foreigners, they kind of unified in that racism as well. So not all Italians, of course, but those who are racist. So, identities are always fluid. You can be Roman, you can be Italian, you can be European, depending on, the discourse and the advantage that you gain from those identities.
As Italians started to migrate to places like Australia, did they bring with them a strong sense of, first and foremost, of Italian identity, or was it more linked to their more localized identity? Like were you a Calabrian or a Sicilian
Yeah.
when you came to Australia, or did you sort of conceptualize yourself as Italian more broadly?
It very much depends on the historical period. And I certainly consider myself Italian, partly because Italians also move within Italy. So if you look at my family, part of it is from the north, part of it is from the south, part of it is from Rome. So it'd be very hard for me, to say exactly what I am. I mean, I was born in Rome, I grew up in Sardinia, so it's often complicated. Um, but also, I guess, when Italy was unified, probably only around 7% of the population spoke Italian. And often these were the most educated people, so not those who were actually migrating. So if you look at migration in the late 19th century, early 20th century, we can assume that, the dominant identity was a local identity, not an Italian one. And in fact, often the Italian identity developed later on, in the country of migration, because often you have to deal with other Italians and you felt closer to other Italians that you felt with people from other parts of the world, or say people from United States if you move to United States. And so a lot of that Italian identity developed abroad as well. Once you move on to the 1950s, by then Italy had been unified almost for 100 years. Almost everybody spoke Italian. And so the Italian identity by then was much, much stronger. And we can assume that both the Italian and the local identity, the regional identity, were, quite strong at that point.
And I think that'll be really interesting to get onto a bit later, how those identities changed within the migrant nation rather
Yeah.
than in their home country. So, Francesco, the story of Italian migration to Australia doesn't just start in the 1950s. I mean, that's the very familiar one, I guess, in our conceptualization of mass migration to Australia post-war. But it's a story of the 19th century as well, isn't it? Can you tell me, why were Italians leaving Italy at that period?
Well, there are many different historical reasons. One was that Italy's unification was very much a form of colonization by the north to the south. It was followed by an attempt to really unify Italy quite strongly, at times violently as well. There was a lot of repression, taxation. Military service at the time was 5 years, which for young people who worked in the field was a very long time. Italy also had a strong tradition of migration before unification, because a large part of Italy has mountains. So Italians used to go down from the mountains to the valleys of Italy and also Europe, for agriculture. So there was already a strong tradition of temporary migration often. And so many Italians after unification started to migrate, especially toward the Americas. The Americas needed an enormous amount of working people for, agriculture and the industry. And this migration was often temporary. So Italians would move to the Americas, make money, and then go back. And so we see most Italians moving, especially to South America and then North America. And it's only a bit later, especially in the 20s, when the United States decided they have too many Italians and really stop Italian migration, that Italians are forced to decide if stay in the United States or go back to Italy. And then from Italy, they start migrating elsewhere, including to Australia. So you have a small number of Italians who moved to Australia already in the late 19th century, but really Australia was very far at the time. So if you could move, especially temporarily, to places like the United States, it wouldn't really make sense to move to Australia. And it's really only in the 1920s that we start to see a larger migration of Italians towards Australia, especially, the cane farms of Queensland, northern Queensland. But at the time, fascism was also trying to stop immigration. And so this is why it's only after World War II that you see really, this mass migration of Italians who really transformed Australia in the 50s, 60s, and so on.
It's interesting. I think from the Australian perspective, we think of Australia being a really popular destination for Italian migration. But when you look at the figures, I was astounded by this. It was just 1.5% of Italian migrants went to Australia. Even Africa was higher at 2%. So we really weren't up there on the list. I mean, as you say, South
Yeah.
America, North America were highly desirable, other European countries, but the very small number of Italian migrants we received in Australia made a huge impact on our lives, but I guess our population was quite small and our
Yeah.
land
And
so huge.
it was very far. It was very, very far. And it wasn't really industrialized much either. I mean, if you compare, I don't know, going to, say, Sydney in the late 19th century or going to New York, I mean,
Incomparable. Yeah.
you can imagine that Australia is popular, but actually it's obvious that New York was much more popular and you could easily cross back to Italy. That's another huge difference.
Yeah, yeah. And then I think Italian-born population in Australia reached its peak in 1971. But even then, it's not that many. It's only 290,000 people, I think, at that time, which was about 11.2% of the overseas-born population who are in Australia. So not really huge numbers. I mean, the migrants at that stage would still have been, I guess, overwhelmingly British. But I'm interested, Francesco, in this sort of idea that Italians migrating around the world, they're not necessarily just going to one place and stopping. They're going back to Italy, but they're also then going to other countries and migrating as well. So there's sort of a mixing of identities and countries of destination too.
Yes, because as I was saying before, there is a long established tradition, especially in the northern part of Italy, to migrate to places like France and Switzerland or to different parts of Italy to work in agriculture, especially. But also musicians, for instance, were often Italian. Children were often sold because Italy was very poor, so there were many children who were sold, and they would do works like, circus. There would be musicians, but also working, cleaning the chimneys in London, for example. Most of the uh, people cleaning the chimneys in London in the 19th centuries were Italian children who would eventually die quite young because of the consequences of that kind of job. So there was already a very strong tradition of moving around Europe. And then that expanded, as means of transportation became faster, then that expanded to the Americas, where there was this incredible, economic growth and industrialization and development of agriculture and so on. And these were places that were far, but still close enough to go back to Italy at some point. And so it's not unusual to see some Italians, say, migrating to other parts of northern Italy first, and then to France, and then to Switzerland, and then sometimes to the UK or sometimes to America, and then going back. And then some of them eventually would migrate to Australia. And this is not just the individual who migrates, right? So sometimes we're the families who migrated and then go back. Sometimes the children or someone who had migrated to America would migrate to Australia instead. So it's very much a multi-directional movement of people. We also have to remember that when Italy was unified, there were around 26 million people. So that's comparable to Australia today. And in the following 100 years, there were 22 million departures. So you can
Wow.
this was an enormous movement of people all over the world. And so it's not surprising really that they were moving in different directions. They were going back and migrating again and so on.
Yeah, and then as you were saying earlier, it's not surprising then that the Italian government starts to say, no, you can't migrate, you can't leave Italy. We need our people here. Was the imperative an economic one largely for my Italian migrants to Australia?
Yes, I mean, there is a dominant narrative that says that people didn't have anything and except maybe a suitcase and they were very poor and they migrated to places like the Americas and then Australia. We actually know that it's very hard to migrate if you don't have anything. Migration requires some level of social, cultural, and financial capital. Often you need to have someone already abroad who help you migrating, who explain you how to migrate, how to get the visas. Often you need some form of financial investment, for the travel and to settle in the new country, to find a job and so on. And so it's often people who were relatively poor, didn't have too much hope of upward mobility, but had some means, either within their family or within their community. So sometimes it would be the family, but sometimes it would be the community that would invest on the youngest and smartest and strongest to go first. And then they would be followed by the brothers and the sisters and the cousins, and then they would marry. And that's what is called chain migration. So it's a very kind of complex system. And so, yes, socioeconomic upward mobility was a main reason. Another very important reason was that there wasn't much hope of such mobility within Italy. So it was much easier to move geographically than it was to move vertically in the social ladder. So that was a very strong motivation. And then, of course, the government was very interested in pushing Italians away because for a long time, Italy was a relatively poor country with a lot of social tension. And so pushing Italians away meant that the social tension would decrease and also the remittances from migrants would really help the development of Italy itself. Migrants had a huge role in the modernization of Italy because of the incredible amount of money that they sent back to their families. So the government was also actually pushing for a long time for migrants to go. And that was also the case in after World War II, when Italy was not just poor, but emerging from a very difficult and long war. And so the government were keen to send working class Italians away to reduce the social tension.
So yeah, that's interesting. So the people who were pushed to leave Italy were from really the sort of working class communities, and they tended to be, did they down in the south of Italy, or were they
Yeah. So
spread out?
so we say working class really because they became working class. But when they migrated from Italy, they were mostly peasants. So they were mostly from the countryside and people working in agricultural fields. There was a strong migration from the north, especially though in the late 19th century, early 20th century. By the 1950s, when mass migration to Australia takes place, the majority of migrants are from the south. Yes, and they migrate, and often they change from agricultural work that they were doing in Italy onto working in constructions, transport, industry, and so on. So very much blue collar, uh, you know, working class. Yeah.
So, I mean, they're coming from, as you said, agricultural areas. Their level of educational attainment presumably is quite low. Level of literacy quite low. Does that then feed into some of the negative stereotypes when they arrive in Australia because they don't come with a whole lot of skills and educational background that other migrants might have been arriving with?
Yes, that is part of the picture, I guess. Sometimes also their skills are not recognized because they're Italian, or maybe they are not useful, so they have to reinvent themselves. Um, I guess the major reasons for hostilities towards Italians, though, are others. So they are reasons like the racism that, Australia was a very racist country at the time, still very much within the white Australia policy. Italians, as you said in your introductions, were one of the first groups. I mean, Chinese before them, but certainly they were one of the first non-Anglo group to migrate in very significant numbers to Australia. Um, there was also the influence of anthropologists, Italian anthropologists from the north, and more in general, intellectuals from northern Italy who tended to be quite racist towards southern Italians. And many of these intellectuals were actually very influential within English-speaking countries. The classic example is Lombroso, one of the founder of modern criminology, now largely discredited because his theories were really racist. And so Lombroso and his school assumed that Italians from the south were, too influenced by Northern African and Middle Eastern blood, and therefore were not really white. And that sort of racist ideology also played a significant role. So you can see that in the 1950s, the Australian bureaucracy is still discussing, are Italians really white? They are not completely convinced. Maybe the Northerners, yes, we can say, but the Southerners, maybe not. And in fact, they open all their offices in Northern Italy. So when they want to attract Italian, they open offices in Italy to attract Italians, but they do that in the northern part of Italy. They don't open any offices in the south because they want to attract the Northerners because they think that the Northerners are white enough. And then once Italians are here, of course, you have the Northerners who play that card too. They say we are better than the Southerners. And so that add another element of racism, if you want.
And that catches on in Australia in the sort of, I guess, Australian-born Australians. They adopt some of those stereotypes about Italians
Yes.
who are from different parts of the country. You refer to a White Australia policy, of course, a policy that Australia formally adopted in 1901 at Federation and really lasted till the 1960s. So this mass migration of Italians happens absolutely in a period of white Australia, but it's sort of an expanding definition of who's white. And as you say, there's debates around, are Italians really white enough? Um, how difficult was it in terms of the experiences you've read about and recorded for Italians in the 1950s coming to Australia? What sort of reception did they personally receive?
Um, it was hard. Um, I mean, you have anecdotes like, people, Australians going to Sydney and waiting for Italians and speeding at them. Many Italians tell stories of going to the pub and fighting with Australians. There is also a tendency, though, among the first generation of Italians who were here, who arrived in the 50s, to kind of downplaying the racism. I think that's an important strategy when you want to sort of adapt and integrate into a new society. You learn very quickly that it's not always, in fact, it's never a good idea to criticize that country. And so, the a lot of the migrants don't like to speak too much about migration. And The anecdote I always tell is once I interview a mother and a daughter, and I asked the mother, did you experience racism in Australia? And she said no. And then I asked the daughter, did your mother experience racism in Australia? And she told me yes. And she gave me the example of remembering she was a child and the mother came back from work and the mother was working at a pub and they had peed on her, they had urinated on her, so she was full of urine and very smelly and so on. And the daughter thought that's what they do to my mother. So, but the mother, in remembering that time, was still saying no, there wasn't much racism. So it's a complicated story because not it's very much usually it's the second generation that has acquired enough cultural and social and financial capital to be very open about what was happening to their parents and also to them at school and so on. So it was tough, and it wasn't tough just, racism is not just about acts of racism. Racism is structural, so it's also about discrimination at work. Is about class exploitation. So if you look, for example, at the mining of asbestos, you can clearly see that the migrants who were paid the least and were dying the most were Italians. But there was a group of people who was paid even less and were dying even in larger numbers, and these were the indigenous people of Australia. So you can see how racism structure class exploitation as well. And so, that was another very difficult part of it, because many Italians would eventually get injured at work, or they had to stop that kind of work because it was too heavy. And then they were taught to be, cheaters and trying to get money from the government. And then the myth of the Mediterranean back developed, the idea that all Mediterranean migrants were faking to be suffering from what was in fact the impact of class exploitation.
So, where did these Italian migrants largely go to in that 1950s period? I mean, you talk, I think, about North Queensland and the cane farms. It was obviously a bit a popular destination and pretty backbreaking, literally backbreaking work.
Yeah. Well, initially, many of them actually went to places where there were large construction projects, such as the Snowy Mountains scheme. This is also because not too many, but a good number of them had come to Australia with an agreement where the Australian government was paying part of their trip, but then they had to go to work with the Australian government to say. So many of them went to that kind of large infrastructure projects, including transportation projects and so on. But then they would eventually move to large cities, and most of most of Italian migrants of the post-war period settled in large cities. So Melbourne, especially, and Sydney, significantly as well. And then many of the migrants who were working in the cane field eventually came down to places like Brisbane or even further down to Sydney. A good number of them went to Western Australia as well, but it is very much urban migration by the 1950s. But you still have a relatively good number of people working in agriculture, but the big numbers are in the large cities.
Yes, and then working in, as you said, those sort of manufacturing heavy industries, with again a lot of impact on your body and exposure to pretty nasty chemicals and things that we now know are pretty serious, have pretty serious impacts on your health.
Yeah.
Um, I'm interested in this phenomenon of marriage by proxy, which was a important part of the post-war Italian migrant experience. Can you explain that?
Yes, I mean, I can explain it rationally. It's very hard for me to understand it emotionally, I guess.
Well, indeed, yes, as we'll hear. But yeah, I certainly
Yeah,
would
it's
would
well,
have been a bit
essentially,
uncomfortable with this. with the arrangement myself, but
Yeah.
anyway.
Essentially, they were arranged marriages. So many of the uh, Italians who migrated to Australia were men. And this is because there was a very strong link between, the needs of Australian infrastructure and industry development, and the need for Italians to migrate. And so many men migrated to do that kind of jobs. But then at some point, Italians, of course, needed to find partners. Um, Australian women were not always keen because there was a lot of racism. And the Australian government also was panicking, and not just the government, social workers and so on, because there were all these, very young, often handsome, single Italian men, and that was seen really as a social problem, how to manage this kind of energy, I guess. So one solution, of course, was to bring women across. But part of the problem is that Italy and Australia were very far, so it wasn't that easy to bring these women across. And at the time in Italy, there was still a very strong sense of honor and shame. So for, I always tell my students, if you were raped as a woman in 1950s Australia, you'll be forced to marry your rapist. And then the rapist would then go to jail as long as he married you. So, there was a very strong need to protect women from these kind of situations. Um, and and so, the idea of honors and shame and virginity were still very, very strong in the society. And so the proxy marriage was an attempt to make sure that the woman was married before she started the trip towards Australia. And so often there were priests who organized for a woman from the same town in Italy, to marry a man who had already moved to Australia. Many of these women would therefore marry by proxy. That literally meant that before starting the trip, they had already married the man they had never met. And of course, there are many anecdotes about this. There is a famous Italian movie about this with Claudia Cardinale. The anecdotes are about, women escaping, women, coming down the ferry and just running away, women who suddenly see that their husband is completely different from the photograph, often much older. But in general, as a phenomenon, we think that it worked. I mean, we also know that in general, arranged marriages work better than romantic marriages. I mean, this, of course, is a problematic interpretation of it, because we don't know what it means. What I mean by working it, I mean that they tend to last longer. But that could be simply explained by the fact that if you marry out of love, once the love is over, the marriage is over. But if you don't marry out of love, you might learn to live with that, in a sense. So it's not necessarily a sign of happiness and well-being. But the vast majority of these women stayed with the man they married by proxy, and they had children. We know that there was a lot of domestic violence within these families, and we know that the women, when they tried to escape, they were often pushed back to stay in the family. They were blamed for the domestic violence. So there are a lot of sad stories there, but these are sad stories that are typical of the time. They are not just typical of proxy marriages. I mean, domestic violence in the 50s was, very common. And we see this in letters written by women and in the responses that they get when they ask for help. where they are told, go home and be a good wife, and your husband will stop hitting you.
It's interesting. You talk about these decisions made by communities to send send maybe a member of the community to Australia, and then they might send more. That these are, and the same with the decision to arrange a marriage by proxy was done at a sort of community or priest. Priest would arrange that for someone over in Australia, but it's not about, as I can gather, the individual's choice. I mean, if you migrate these days, it would be your own, your own decision, and you might discuss it with family and friends. But a lot of people just go. This sort of sense that back then communities were making a decision on behalf of that group rather than the individual having too much agency over it.
Well, this is perhaps more of a gender difference. I mean, for men, obviously the community would tend to send those who wanted to go.
Mm.
For women, instead, you can see a very strong resistance to send women abroad because of that culture of honor and shame and protecting women. So, there is a very famous song, Mamma Mia dammi mille lire, in which there is a woman who actually wants to migrate, and the mother is against that. And so there was a lot of social panic in Italy itself about these women, migrating. So sometimes was the community and the family to push these young women to marry by proxy and migrate. But we also know that these women were also experiencing patriarchy and sexism in Italy. And so sometimes migration provided an opportunity for a different life for them. And so we can assume that these women were always forced to marry by proxy, both because we know that the community wasn't always keen on this, and because we know that women anyway had a very tough life in Italy already. Most of them were poor, they were living in the countryside, the society was very patriarchal. So it's a very complex history. It's not possible to say, individuals were just forced, and it's not possible to say they only migrated on their own will. But if I have to generalize, I would say that probably for men, in the vast majority of cases, the community would send those who wanted to go. And for women, as usual, it's a much more complex story, because the intersection of sexism and racism and class exploitation, and it makes it very complicated. But
Yeah.
I always say we should not assume that women did not have agency, because that is also part of the racist view of Italians by Australians. This idea that Italian women didn't have any agency, they were just victims of a patriarchal society, is very much, a stereotype that doesn't really align with the reality of Italy.
I'm interested too, Francesco, in the attitudes of Italians to Australians, because I understand there was concern that Australian women had bad influence on Italian women, that they had loose morals, that Australian men were to be avoided by the Italian women. I mean, as you say, there was this whole idea of honor and chastity that it was obviously very much rooted in the Catholic Church and Catholic doctrine that the Italians as a predominantly Catholic country were bringing with them. So how did that play out once they arrived in Australia in terms of the relations between the two communities?
Well, one of the arguments I make in my books is that if you are a victim of racism and sexism, you also tend to develop a bad opinion of the people of which you are a victim,
The
which seems to
perpetrators,
me,
yeah.
yes, the perpetrators. So it seems to me that that makes perfect sense. But also you want to find a way of reassuring yourself about your worth, your values, your identity. And so it's quite common for migrants to develop this strong impression that they have a moral superiority compared to Australians in this instance. And then on top of this, we have to think that the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s are a period of incredible social change. You know, we have the development of course, feminism already existed, but, you know, this is a time of where women's rights really developed, and, you know, very strong feminism, women liberation, the sexual revolution, the peel. So Italians interpret a lot of changes that are actually historical and are also happening in Italy as a difference of culture and society between Italy and Australia. Okay, so they migrate when Italy hasn't modernized yet in that sense. They arrive here at the time when Australia is starting to modernize, and Italy too, and they interpret that as a difference between Italians and Australia. And so they started to assume that, for example, Australian women have much more freedom than Italian women, that Australian women have more free mores and sexual attitudes and so on. So they develop this sense of superiority based on the idea that Italians care more about the family and they care more about the honor and the chastity of women and so on. And also we have to remember that the vast majority of Italians, the first generation, they marry within the Italian community. So they have a limited understanding of Australian society, I guess. They, of course, meet Australians in the street, in the pub, at times in the workplace, but the vast majority of people they tend to socialize with are other Italians.
I was interested in the figure you have in your book that in the 1971 Australian census, 95% of Italian-born women over the age of 19 were married, and the vast majority to fellow Italians. So exactly as you say, these women were almost all married and almost all married to Italians. So that very much keeping within the community. I'm interested, Francesco, in, you migrate in the 1950s and you leave a sort of an Italy that is only just sort of starting to modernize and industrialize. So you then, I presume, don't get to go back very often, if at all, because of the distance and expense. But you have a concept of Italy that is at a point in time. And as you observe Australia developing and modernizing, and you're making those comparisons between the two societies, you aren't necessarily using a contemporary comparison. And then how does that influence your sort of sense of Italian identity that is sort of almost held in aspic?
Yes, so there is a very strong tension there because, on the one hand, you remember Italy as it was.
Mm.
On the other hand, because you have migrated and you are encountering a lot of different people and languages and culture, your own identity as Italian is evolving. That's why I usually tend not to say that Italians were frozen in time, because actually the Italian migrants were evolving as well. It is more that sort of idea of Italy that it kinds of stay, in the past. But even then, everything that they think about Italy is reinterpreted over time through the new lenses that they acquire, not only because now they live in Italy, but because their children start to be teenagers and they bring new ideas, they bring different way of speaking, different way of thinking. And that has an impact on the parents and grandparents as well. Um, what we know is that when Italians finally go back, for example, after 20 years, of course, they find a country that has changed dramatically, which is why Italians stop to migrate, because Italy becomes, in 20 years or so, one of the richest and most industrialized countries in the world. So, and that brings incredible social changes as well. So, of course, many of them almost don't recognize the Italy they had left. But I wouldn't go from that to say that their idea of Italy or that their identity is frozen in time. These were people who were negotiating and mediating among very different identities. They were still in touch with Italy. They were in touch with Italians in other parts of the world who were from the same towns or the same family. They were interacting with different peoples in Australia. So there were people who were engaged all the time in what we now call intercultural exchange or intercultural communication. And so we also have to distinguish between what they become and what they tell us they become. The narrative is not always the reality, it's part of the reality, it's how you try to make sense of a reality. But in doing that, you always tend to select specific things. And it's not surprising that what you select often is from when you were young and from the Italy that you remember, and so on.
Yeah, that
But
sense of nostalgia is very strong as you age. I wanted to finish off our discussion, Francesco, with the story of Lena Gustin. Is that right? I'm probably
Agustin, yeah,
Gustin. There you go.
yes,
Thank you very much. Who was she was a journalist, wrote for the Italian language newspaper Fiamma. I'm probably going to have
yes,
watched
that's
that
good.
too.
Love him.
But she was sort of like an agony aunt in a way, wasn't she? Answering questions written to her by Italian migrants. And you've read these letters, haven't you? And some of them were heavily redacted, and some of them were quite revealing, intimately revealing.
Yeah.
Tell me about what she was reading and about, these were obviously the some of the deepest, darkest secrets of Italian women living in Australia.
Yeah, so she was a teacher. She migrated uh, with the husband from Italy. It's not really clear why. Um, and then, being relatively educated at the time compared to the vast majority of Italians, she managed to get a job as a, yes, sort of agony aunt editor. And she started receiving a lot of letters from Italian migrants, especially women, and she answers and she provides advice, but she also keep many of these letters. I think when I counted them many years ago, I counted more than 700 of these
Wow.
letters. It's a large archive that she then donated to the State Library of New South Wales, where they are now and where I studied them. And so I was able to see both the original letters and the redacted letters and the responses by Lena. And what we see is what I call the editing of the body. So the original letters are very much centered around the body, because many of these women were suffering, many of these women were experiencing very hard time. A good number of them wrote from mental health institutions. There was a lot of domestic violence, as I was saying before. So the body is always present in the letters, but also because they come from a peasant background. And although that's a very religious background, it's also a background where people tend to speak more about the body compared to, the very respectable middle class of the 1950s. And then as you see the edited letter, all that body disappeared, the domestic violence disappear, their problems with sexuality disappear, I found a number of original letters written by a transgender person who wanted to become a man, and all that completely disappeared. And actually, Len Agustin then engaged with the mother, and we can see all the process of repressing this person identity through doctors. Um, there are letters that men write about their impotence or about being gay, and it's quite weird that they write to a journalist
Yeah.
about that. If you think about men in the 50s, but I guess part of that is that many of these migrants were so lonely. They were alone. They didn't have a network, and especially when you consider the body, sexuality, illness, mental health, those were not topics that you could address with your family, right? So often they would tend to write to somebody they didn't know, hoping to remain anonymous and to receive some good advice. So they are very interesting letters because present a very different image of Italian lives in 1950s and 1960s Australia. And to me, showed that actually the materiality of life, the body, the money, if you're employed or unemployed, and so on, mattered to them much more than their identity. And it's the smaller percentage of middle class migrants who are very much focused on identity, on respectability, on building this narrative of Italians as a good migrant community, and so on. While the vast majority of working class migrants are much more interested on what is happening in their life every day, what are the challenges, and how to face them when you are often as isolated in another country without a strong control of the language and so on.
Well, it shows the human condition goes well beyond your identity. We all experience the frailties of humanity and the individual experiences in our own body, irrespective of you being Italian, Australian, Indigenous, and and your sexuality. So it's I think would have been a fascinating exercise to read all those letters and hear all those innermost secrets of these new Australians, people who
Yeah, and
became Australians.
you always wonder what happened to them,
What
right?
happened to them?
Of
Yeah.
course, it's not ethically, I know their names and surnames, but of course I can't follow up, right? But I always wonder while I was reading them, what happened to these women in the psychiatric hospital? What happened to that transgender person? And what happened to, there was a guy who really wanted to marry a Chinese girl and everybody was against him, but he really wanted to marry her. And because I married a Thai Chinese woman, that for me was, always thought about that couple. Who knows what happened to them? We can only imagine, but we'll never know. I mean,
No.
that's part of the beauty of history, is that you discover a little bit about the past, but also you can imagine much more about the future of these people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Francesco Ricatti, thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light. It's been a absolutely fascinating discussion and a really important, I think, window into a very important part of our community in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a privilege.